Hi, I'm Travis.
I'm Kay.
I'm Bob.
I'm Fabio.
I'm Brian.
And this is ComicsVerse.
A podcast for John Jones, the Manhunter from Mars, his world, and the vile menagerie of villains he must confront.
One of the primary points of divergence from Judaism to Christianity was the Talmud, voluminous writings on the oral tradition of the Jewish people. The Talmudic writings begin at a point between what Christianity would refer to as the Old Testament and the New Testament, but they continue until well after the advent of Christianity. The Talmudic writings were hugely important to the Jewish people because it was the accumulated wisdom of their scholars interpreting the Tanakh and its relationship to then modern society. And one of the things that's interesting about the Talmud was you'd have a scholar do one set of writing. And then sometimes centuries later, another scholar would come in and essentially write alongside that text, responding to it and offering their own interpretation. Those subsequent writings were referred to as responsa, because rather than referring directly to the Tanakh, you were seeing a conversation across time in writing between two or more other interpretations of the scripture. I'm swiftly running out of time to create podcasts related directly to the 60th anniversary of the Martian Manhunter within the year in which it's taking place. John Jones turned 61 in September of 2016. And one deep dive I've really been wanting to do, but have been putting off for over a year now, is a series of responsa to other people's written and verbal interpretations of the Manhunter from Mars. And I'd like to begin with ComicsVerse, your source for in-depth comics analysis. I'm not sure how long they've been around, but I only just now heard of them. They've apparently been doing blogging and podcasting and the like, some webcomics as well. And they released their 60th episode of the podcast, December 24th, 2015. It's part of a series that they were going to undertake called The Best Underrated Characters in Comics. As far as I can tell, they only got 2 deep so far to date, and their initial offering was on the Martian Manhunter. So the idea here is I'll offer a snippet of their podcast, which I recommend you listen to before this one, and then I'll offer my own analysis of their statements and my own opinions filtered through the prism of a guy who spent a lot of time thinking about the sleuth from outer space. Let's go ahead and take a moment to meet the commentators at ComicsVerse.
Hi, I'm Kay Honda. I'm production coordinator for ComicsVerse. This was kind of like an introductory course for me for Martian Manhunter as well. I've always been familiar with him, but after doing the reading, I find him perfect.
Hi, I'm Bob. I'm new to the podcast, but I've been a writer for a couple months, and I also help out with other office duties. Martian Manhunter to me is if Superman didn't have a micro penis.
Oh, hey, I'm Fabio. I'm a writer, podcaster for ComicsVerse, and after reading the Martian Manhunter comics, I feel like he's almost like a necessary character in like every sort of team. I think every team needs that kind of individual that sort of is like the heart and soul and the voice of reason, and I really like him for that.
Hi, I'm Brian Del Pozo, staff writer, social media specialist, podcaster, all-around funny voice guy. I like Martian Manhunter, but I feel like he really works more as part of a team. I think as a standalone character, he's not the most interesting.
I'm Travis Zapp, the editor-in-chief of ComicsVerse. You have a much more fond opinion of Martian Manhunter than I think I do. At times, he feels like the heart and soul of the team, but I feel like at other times, he feels like the most unnecessary piece of the puzzle.
How dare you?
I also feel like a lot of the Martian Manhunter is the heart and soul of the Justice League. I feel like the only reason that he's kind of seen as that is because so many writers have just said that. Look at the New 52, and I'm no big fan of the New 52, but essentially you lifted out Martian Manhunter for Cyborg in the Justice League, and it didn't work any better or any worse.
Okay, this is interesting because the fellow counters his own argument. He mentions that he doesn't like the New 52, like a lot of people. And one of the main complaints about the New 52 is that it doesn't feel like the DC universe that people felt in their hearts from their exposure to its characters across decades of time. If you asked a DC fan to list some of the things that bother them about the New 52, one of the things that would probably consistently come up was removing Martian Manhunter from founding status in the Justice League and replacing him with Cyborg. Cyborg himself, I don't think, is the problem. I think that having an 8th founder wouldn't have been a major issue, just like when Black Canary was made a founder in the late 1980s. They didn't exactly riot. What caused problems in the 80s was that they had removed Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Clearly, Martian Manhunter's absence isn't as impactful as major league characters like that, but it's just one of those little things that bothers people because it doesn't feel quite right without the Magnificent Seven, especially after Grant Morrison had such success implanting the notion of a pantheon, a Magnificent Seven team of founding Justice Leaguers during his very popular revival of the book in the late 90s. And see, that conception of an archetypal archetypal JLA is very important to the success of the Justice League in comics. Justice League of America #1 came out very swiftly on the heels of the League's tryout stories in Brave and the Bold. The first issue sold 1 million copies. And if you look at any of those early covers, you'll notice that neither Superman nor Batman are on them. The editors of those two characters did not want to water down the appeal of their own books, so the roles of Superman and Batman were minimalized over the course of the first year or so of Justice League of America. I suspect that had an impact because a year into the book, Justice League of America #12 sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 340,000 copies. That's better than anything sells a day, and it wasn't any small change in the early 60s either, but it's still quite a come down from 1 million. And because of that decline, eventually the publishers at DC pressured the editors to allow Justice League more access to Superman and Batman. But the fact remains that in selling the Justice League in the first year or so of its existence, the team at its surface was Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and the Martian Manhunter. And it's important to understand why the Martian Manhunter was there, because he was simply a backup feature in Detective Comics. When he was initially conceived, he wasn't even a superhero, he was an alien detective. Most of the first year or two of his adventures, he was a plainclothes officer of a police force. It was only shortly before the conception of the Justice League of America that he began exhibiting more overt aspects of the superhero genre. The editors essentially turned Martian Manhunter into a superhero specifically so he could be a founding member of the Justice League. And most specifically, quite obviously, he was likely there to replace Superman. Because Justice League of America editor Julie Schwartz had no way of knowing how long he would have access to Superman, but he needed a Superman type in the book. Despite the Martian Manhunter having a wide variety of powers, far more than anybody could list off the top of their heads, even within the first 5 years of his publication, it was Justice League that really centered on his Superman type powers because that's the role they wanted him to play. And for some reason, they also overemphasized Martian breath of all things. So if Martian Manhunter seems somewhat limited in the role of a green Superman, it's probably because that's what he was fashioned into because of the Justice League of America's need for a Superman type character. But it also shows why the Martian Manhunter is considered the heart and soul of the Justice League because of his utility. Because he's in the Justice League as the major superpowered force when the team needs that and has an absence of it. In those early issues, Julie Schwartz didn't know if he was going to continue to have access to Superman. Martian Manhunter filled that role. The sales of Justice League of America slipped throughout the 70s and early 80s. And in an effort to revive sales, pretty much all of the iconic Justice Leaguers were taken out of the book in 1984. And again, in the absence of a Superman type, Martian Manhunter filled that role. And in fact, he was the only iconic Justice League member that was still on the team up to the very last issue. When DC reworked the book in 84, they'd also kept Aquaman, Zatanna, and Elongated Man. Clearly not the most popular Leaguers, but definitely strongly associated with the team. However, Aquaman left within the first year. Batman came on for maybe a 6-month period, and Zatanna was swept out of the book toward the end. In the final issues, Martian Manhunter, the then leader of the team, was forced to disband the group, and while Elongated Man and his wife decided to go into a brief retirement, it was Jean who was still left to turn out the lights and deal with the consequences of a murder spree initiated by Professor Ivo that claimed the lives of 2 of his young charges. He was also the only member of that team to carry over into Justice League International where that book started, the only other real name brand hero being Batman. But with those 2 founding members available to center the team as a Justice League, sales jumped up by double, around 164,871 on average in the first year. Batman, by and large, left the book barely over 6 months into the series. It only popped up sporadically from then on. Justice League International became an entire franchise of books without having access to most of the major superheroes in the DC universe because they were all in the midst of being rebooted and revitalized in the post-crisis era. It was during this period that the concept of Martian Manhunter as the heart and soul of the Justice League was sold the hardest because he was the only founding member that the creators had unrestricted access to. He was the leader and the Superman type within the core Justice League America book. He was the fellow who crossed over into the other titles like Justice League Quarterly and Justice League Europe, representing the core leadership of the entire JLI. And when he was spun off into the new book Justice League Task Force, he was again one of only 2 recurring characters during the original conception of the group as a Mission Impossible team that would be formed out of various superheroes on an arc-by-arc basis. But also when the book was altered to become a junior Justice League where younger heroes would train under the Martian Manhunter, he was the only character to really lend validity to the book even being called Justice League because he was the only classic hero within their group. If it hadn't been for Martian Manhunter, I don't think anybody would talk about Justice League Task Force anymore because its ties to the JLA and its legacy are so tenuous, which is another important matter because when the JLA reformed under the banner of the Magnificent Seven under Grant Morrison, you really had 6 individual heroes, iconic heroes: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman. Those 6 characters, to varying degrees, are successful solo heroes. Aquaman had his own cartoon in the 60s. He was one of the 4 founding members of the Super Friends, a massive gateway presentation for the general public to the DC universe. And while he's viewed as an important part of the JLA, he's still Aquaman. He's still the solo character. Green Lantern was the center of his own franchise. And at the time of JLA, had a legacy character, Kyle Rayner, slinging the ring. Same goes for Wally West. He wasn't the original Flash, but he'd stepped up into Barry Allen's boots and improved himself to be an equal to the icons. He was the Flash as far as everyone was concerned at that point. Within the Magnificent Seven, who had not been the Justice League in decades at that point, the only member who didn't represent as a soloist, who represented a continuity within the JLA itself, was Martian Manhunter. It was he who had been a member of Justice League Detroit right up to the end. It was he who was a founding member and leader of the Justice League International. It was he who remained with the League after the dissolution of the Justice League Task Force. When every other one of those 6 iconic heroes had abandoned the League, often to dire fates in fact, Jon Jones had the most connection to all of these characters who had carried on the Justice League banner in the absence of the icons. He was the guy who worked with Vibe and Vixen and Gypsy and Steel and Booster Gold and Blue Beetle and Fire and Ice. None of the other big heroes had time for those characters. The argument has been made many times that keeping that iconic Justice League as a group leads to stale stories because it's hard to find challenges for that many powerful name brand characters to fight on a monthly basis. But at the same time, the JLA construct, the Pantheon, enforced the idea that you don't have a true Justice League without the big guns. And the only person who isn't necessarily a big gun, the only person that you can do stuff with, the only person that has connections to all these other Justice Leagues that aren't represented by the Magnificent Seven is the Martian Manhunter. Therefore, the heart and soul of the Justice League. And therefore, his absence in the New 52 Justice League is felt emotionally, if not intellectually, because in putting Cyborg onto the team, his legacy is as a Titan. His legacy is as a member of the Superpowers team of the mid-80s. His legacy is of a young hero stepping up into the Justice League. His legacy is along the lines of a Firestorm or a Kyle Rayner. But his legacy is not with the Justice League. He does not represent for other heroes who are not allowed to be in the Justice League because they're not big enough or good enough. That's the role that Jon Jones plays. Cyborg does reveal another issue with the League. As I mentioned, the Morrison Porter JLA proved that people who buy Justice League comics want at least the 6 iconic heroes or the majority of those 6 within the League. When JLA number 1 was released, it was ranked 24th in the top 100. It sold 104,486 copies. The following year, the book had risen up to a rank of 7th and was selling 111,425 copies. At the end of its run of 10 years, it was still ranked 15 and selling 74,313 copies. The book did revitalization and received it with the 2006 relaunch Justice League of America, which sold 212,178 copies. But here's the thing. By the end of the first year, it was apparent that Brad Meltzer was trying to follow a construction of the team that was closer to the Bronze Age. He wanted to feature a lot of the second and third string heroes on his group, buoyed by some of the major icons, but not all of them. So even just a year into his run on the book, it had dropped down to sales of 131,412. And then by the following year, the majority of the icons had been abandoned. It slipped in rank to 12th and was only selling 81,408. Now, by the very end of that volume, issue 59, none of the major iconic heroes were in the group anymore. But Cyborg had been a member of it because the group by that point was essentially the Teen Titans. You had former Robin Dick Grayson serving as Batman temporarily. You had Donna Troy, the former Wonder Girl, serving as Troya. And then you also had a bunch of characters that had never been associated with the Justice League, like Kongorilla and Starman. And it gave the book a sense of illegitimacy because there was no continuity. Meltzer had also, as a Bronze Age fan, decided not to use the Martian Manhunter for virtually his entire run, and that carried over into the run of Dwayne McDuffie and James Robinson. Now, events following Infinite Crisis had rendered Martian Manhunter a somewhat toxic character, so it's understandable that there may have been some issues with including him in the book. He had also very briefly flirted with becoming a member of Batman's Outsiders team. But I have to think that having Martian Manhunter there on the end, and maybe a few of the other more accessible Magnificent Seven members, Aquaman maybe, or the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern, some characters that were more closely associated with the League, would have made that League feel more valid. That was an underpowered team. That was a team that didn't feel connected to any of the Justice League volumes, and that's a team that I think could have very much benefited from the Martian Manhunter's presence. The lack of any of those core Justice Leaguers, and honestly, especially Martian Manhunter, I think hurt them. And that's why the book was only selling 43,545 copies at the end, ranked 32nd in the top 100. And I think DC finally learned their lesson because they relaunched Justice League with a new number 1. It was the first book of the New 52. It was the first place in sales. It sold 171,344 copies. And that was likely on the strength of a very popular writer in Jeff Johns, a very popular artist in Jim Lee, and 6 of the 7 Magnificent 7 Justice Leaguers. However, it's worth noting that Justice League number 1 had sold 40,000 copies less than the previous volume, despite having a much bigger name creative team. And I think this is very similar to what had happened with JLA debuting at 24 back in 1996, because the lack of those iconic heroes had so demoralized the fan base that there was a lack of interest at first and they had to build up from there. But I think another issue is that there was a rejection among older fans like myself of the New 52 as a whole. And you had that Cyborg sticking out like a sore thumb, letting everybody know that this was not the classic Justice League. This was not going to be a return to the league they'd known in their childhood. And I don't think the kids came to the yard so much for this one. Now, the book has had staying power. That volume was still doing 120,796 copies a year in, 103,936 copies 2 years in, and the final issue of the volume, 52, sold 72,413. That's only a couple of thousand short of where JLA had been 10 years earlier. So it's clear that you need the core Justice Leaguers to support the league. My argument, though, is that John Jones is the heart and soul of the Justice League, because if for some reason you don't have those big 6, if he's there, you still have a Justice League. It's still viable. And he was able to lend that viability to the Justice League at times when none of those core members were available. He was the face of the Justice League International, and those books sold gangbusters based on their quality without those core members. Because he's so powerful, and because he was an icon of the Justice League, if for some reason you can't have the big guys, you can have Martian Manhunter. The problem at DC is that they have not made the effort necessary to prove the Martian Manhunter's viability as a soloist, and he spent so much time holding up and being held up by the Justice League that he's lost much of his own identity to them. And that's where the statement that the Martian Manhunter may not be as interesting of a character solo as he is a member of the Justice League has merit. I personally think that he has the raw material to be a valuable soloist, but it takes time, effort, and research that I haven't seen any current DC editors or talent willing to invest in the character.
Yeah, so just like Superman, we have this last of your kind of dynamic going on, but in the readings that we did for this, we find out that that's not necessarily the case.
When Superman was created in 1938, his alienness wasn't a major factor to the character. It was basically a way of explaining why he had powers far beyond those of mortal men. However, his creators had come out of sci-fi fandom, and those influences began to manifest in the 1940s. And then they peaked in the 1950s and 60s when science fiction in general was booming in popular culture. Superman was created by a couple of Jews, and his origin is essentially that of Moses. He's an immigrant who comes to the United States and fights for social justice. His main competitor was the Gentile Captain Marvel, a character that had a lot of similarities to Superman, but was taken much less seriously by his creators, and was largely defined by mysticism and his extended family of similarly powered beings. After Superman had successfully sued Captain Marvel out of existence, the editor of the Superman titles, Mort Weisinger, brought over much of the creative team from the better-selling Captain Marvel to the Superman titles, and they similarly fleshed out the Man of Steel with a whole family of similar beings. Weisinger had also come out of science fiction fandom, and Weisinger was also a Jew, who identified very strongly with the Superman character. And what you find in the 50s and 60s is a heavy emphasis on Superman having survived the Holocaust of the planet Krypton. That despite having this extended family of similar survivors, he was haunted by the loss of his people. Despite having grown up in America with farmer adoptive parents in the breadbasket of the country, Superman was not an American. He was not a human. He was a Kryptonian who was much smarter and much more powerful and unable to relate to the rest of humanity. And so he desperately wanted to return to Krypton. And a great many stories from that time period revolve around his going back through time, trying to prevent the catastrophe that struck Krypton and failing. It's been theorized that these stories were informed by Mort Weisinger's own issues with the loss of relatives and his own people in the Holocaust during World War II. And then metaphorically, he was having Superman go back to Krypton and fail to save his people the way his own people had largely been destroyed and been failed failed. The public began to turn on that formula going into the 1970s. The editorial range shifted from Weisinger to Julie Schwartz, and greater efforts were made to humanize and make Superman more relatable than he had been previously, and to tell stories that were more character-centric as opposed to plot-oriented. These choices informed the characterization of Superman in the Richard Donner movies of the late 70s and early 80s, and Christopher Reeve's portrayal of Superman strongly informed the revamp of the character made by John Byrne in 1986. Byrne made the Kryptonians much colder and very much disassociated Superman from his Kryptonian heritage. He allowed Superman's parents to continue to live into Superman's adulthood, and Superman was plainly acculturated as a United States citizen, as a farm boy from Kansas. He went from somebody who could not really have relations with human beings to someone who married and shared his life with Lois Lane. Superman ceased to be a recent immigrant to the United States and became a representation of second and third generation immigrant Americans. He may not have come from here originally, but he grew up here, he was born here, and his identity was wrapped up in being an Earthling and specifically a American citizen. This fundamentally altered the character of Superman. And the Superman that most people know today was not the Superman that was present in the Silver Age of comics. In 1955, the Martian Manhunter was invented. He came from a living Mars. He was a young adult on that planet. He still had the equivalent of a teenage brother and still lived at home with his parents, or at least dined with them. He goes to his job as a scientist one day. He's working on an experiment. He gets zapped by a ray and brought against his will to Earth. While Mars is technologically advanced, they haven't yet set up their space program. It's in development. He figures within the next few years, Mars will have a rocket that can reach Earth. But until then, his best hope is the robot brain that brought him to Earth. Unfortunately, the scientist who brought him unintentionally to our world died from a heart attack, and this was the mid-1950s, and he was not an American, not an Earthling, in a time period where our country and the world in general had a great deal of hostility toward anything that was from outside of their sphere. And so he used his shape-shifting abilities to take on the form of the dominant life form on Earth, a white male, and he inserted himself into a position of authority as a police officer, as a means of surviving on a hostile world and working toward the benefit of its citizens without drawing undue attention to himself or significantly altering the course of human events, as well as having an awareness that despite his extraordinary breadth of powers, he also had an overwhelming and easily exploited weakness to fire. Any human being, a child, could light a fire and potentially strip him of his powers and kill him. The Martian Manhunter was not a pilgrim. Plymouth Rock landed on him, and he made the best of a bad situation. But at least on the surface, his ultimate goal was to find a means of returning to Mars. Mars was still alive, it was thriving. The world as he left it was basically a simulation of the atomic age American family. And that's why being a Martian is somewhat key to the character, because he's not supposed to be some xenomorph. He's not supposed to be something from beyond our normal conception. The Martians are essentially just like us. They're familiar. They're only one planet over. But they're green, and the culture's a little different, and they have abilities that we don't have. So because we're primitive, and we're jealous, and we're hateful, we're a threat to ourselves and to any visitors that have unfortunately landed on our planet against their will. So right off the bat, the stories of Superman and the Martian Manhunter are very different. Superman was created to be the first superhero, and throughout his history, he has been a superhero first and foremost. Martian Manhunter did not appear in his Martian form very often in his early years. He assumed a human form, he solved human crimes by secretly employing his innate alien abilities. But he was in crime stories, he was in detective stories, he was in a book called Detective Comics. He was not a superhero. He did not fight super villains. He occasionally ran into criminal scientists, and if another alien happened upon Earth, he usually sent them packing. That makes him lightweight, pulpy, science fiction crime drama, not a superhero. By being drawn into the Justice League of America, the Manhunter's abilities were better defined and limited. His appearance became much more superheroic. So did his foes. And the imposition of a shared universe altered the character. The character went through changes, but he was still a Martian from a living Mars. He did not have a lot in common with Superman besides a power set. He was a cop, and then for a few years, he was involved in a bunch of supernatural-themed adventures with a fellow alien sidekick, or actually it was an other-dimensional being. And then in his final incarnation, he was a spy working in Europe against an international criminal organization. The parallels of Superman don't begin until 1969, because at that point, we had managed to send satellites to Mars, get pictures of the surface, and determine that there were no civilizations on Mars, and that Mars itself could not sustain a life form similar to humanity, if any kind of life form at all. Because we already had a Martian superhero, and because he was a member of the Justice League of America, and because fans wanted wanted to know what had happened to that character after he drifted away from the team. The answer that was provided was to create a genocide on the planet of Mars that rendered that planet uninhabitable so that it would reflect the reality we'd recently learned through science and sent the surviving Martians off to another planet in another solar system. Like Superman, most of the Martian race was gone. But unlike Superman, a significant number of Martians remained. Maybe it was dozens, maybe it was hundreds. I believe that they actually had it in canon as thousands. And John Jones's disappearance from mainstream comics for a good number of years was attributed to his going off to this other world with his people to help rebuild. John Jones is more similar to Superman's father Jor-El than he is to Kal-El. And like Jor-El, his nemesis was a military figure. In place of General Zod, you have Commander Blanks. Unlike with Krypton, though, Mars was destroyed as a deliberate act. And the primary instigator of that act was brought to justice by John Jones via a lethal conflict. Blanks died at the end of their encounter. Then John goes to a desert world and tries to rebuild Martian society there. In explaining away the true science of reality on Mars, John Jones was poured into the mold of a Holocaust survivor. His people became Israelites. And this is where the common ground between Superman and Martian Manhunter truly forms. The point at which the Martian Manhunter becomes a sole survivor of Mars isn't until 1988. My understanding of the rationale is that Superman had lost all of his extended family in Crisis on Infinite Earths, retroactively, so he never knew they existed. His powers were reduced, and DC didn't want a whole race of beings of similar or even greater power than Superman running around in their new continuity. Also, Superman had vacated his Holocaust analogy by more wholly adopting his role as a natural-born human being, a citizen of the United States, at birth. And so whether the creators were canny about it or not, in getting rid of the other Martians so they didn't interfere with DC continuity, so that they did not challenge Superman, the Martian Manhunter more fully adopted the role of the Silver Age Superman. He was a sole survivor again. He had lost a race that could not be replaced by humanity. He would always be other. He would always have experience and powers and intellect and emotions that separated him from humanity, and he would always long to reconnect with that. But unlike Superman, he did not have the device of traveling back through time to Mars. There were no other Martian survivors for him to interact with the way that Superman had, even in the context of the Phantom Zone criminals, or a single cousin in Supergirl. No super pets, no Comet, no Streaky, no Beppo. It was just John alone, the last of his kind in all of creation. And in that respect, he most resembled Superman of his entire publishing history, but it was a version of Superman that at the time he adopted it no longer existed, and to this day no longer exists. But at the same time, that change happened in a 1988 miniseries with Martian Manhunter's name on the cover. The very next time John Jones received a miniseries, in 1992, he's faced with the same problem that you have with a character like Superman. If he's the last Martian, and the natural inclination is to tell Martian stories with the Martian Manhunter, how do you get by without any other Martians? So literally, John Jones has made The Last Martian in 1988, and not 4 years later, in the very next miniseries, another Martian survivor is introduced. In 1996, just 4 years later, Grant Morrison wanted to use Martians, and specifically a Martian invasion, to launch his new JLA series, which also reflected a version of the Justice League's origin story from 1977. So he not only brought back Martians, he brought back hundreds of Martians, and he also brought back the conception of a Martian racial war with binary opponents of green skin and white skin, which had not been referenced since the concept was first brought up in 1969. No other story has been told with white-skinned Martians from the time they were introduced in 1969 until 1996. But once again, these were white Martians, and they were from times prehistoric to John Jones' own time. They were in essence cavemen compared to himself, and they were from a different culture and a different time period. So despite the fact that they were Martians, they weren't his Martians. He had as much in common with the white Martians seen in the JLA story arc New World Order as you or I would have with Cro-Magnon Man. They're practically a different species. So John Jones was still alone. However, when he received his own ongoing series in 1998, numerous stories were told of the relationship between the green and white Martians, their relationship to Saturnians of red skin, and various permutations of green Martians from Jean's own time or thereabouts. They were somehow still active. So again, John Jones was a sole survivor of Mars for no more than 4 years, and he's now coming up on 20 years where there have been hundreds of other survivors of a variety of races related to J'onn J'onzz, including his own. So in this respect, he only has so much in common with Superman. And the ways in which he has commonality with Superman, it's an incarnation of Superman that no longer exists. Is he truly all that similar to Superman? Or is he actually a continuation of an aspect of Superman that's been abandoned, that's no longer relevant to our culture? My point is that J'onn J'onzz was not created to be an analog to Superman, and despite being forced into that role repeatedly, to a large extent, functionally, he has not been similar to Superman. And where he has been, he was a Superman in a time when Superman was no longer that version of the Man of Steel. And in fact, one of the things that I like the most about the character is that where I have largely been poisoned to Superman by the fact that DC Comics doesn't really seem to know what they want to do with him, by the fact that Warner Brothers can't seem to adapt him into other media without showing clear contempt for the concept, and from the fact that the Superman that I gravitate toward is not the Superman that has been present in any media for most of my lifetime. Whatever it is about Superman that Martian Manhunter resembles, that's the part of Superman I liked best, and it's the part of Superman that's no longer present anywhere else but within the Martian Manhunter. I think it'd be better to think of him as a legacy, as an adopter of aspects that have been cast off by a major cultural figure the world over. And rather than try to diminish Martian Manhunter by comparing him disparagingly to Superman, recognize that the Manhunter has taken unwanted, discarded aspects of the Man of Steel and continued them and enhanced them and built a great character out of those aspects that are no longer relevant to Superman, but are still relevant to the human condition and to the popular consciousness. Specifically in the respect that J'onn J'onzz is a metaphor for survivors of Holocaust, fewer and fewer of whom actually continue to live in our day and age, but that the Jewish people have vowed to never forget. And for the sake of the human condition, as a warning to never allow such things to ever happen again, J'onn J'onzz helps us to never forget. And he helps to remind us of Superman's Jewish heritage, which I feel has been whitewashed out and diminished that character. But I can live with that so long as J'onn J'onzz can continue to carry that standard.
The parallels between the racism on Mars and the alienation that he was feeling on Earth, I just found a very interesting parallel there, particularly in the Brave New World story, where that whole theme of sort of this racial tension seemed to be such a pervading theme throughout the series there that I was wondering what exactly was the message supposed to be, because, you know, we're seeing the victim of this alienation and how that's affecting him, but then we're also seeing a different side of this coin where that segregation is almost serving him in a way because it's a warning system. I know that all of these aliens are like this and that this is going to happen because of this, so I need to go attack them and, you know, stop their plan. Like, there was just a strange balance there or something. I don't know.
I was confused by references to this story in the podcast. It's typically referred to as Brave New World, which caused me to confuse it with New World Order from JLA, so I had to disconnect as far as what they were talking about. And then later on, as they gave more details, I began to realize that they were actually referring to Martian Manhunter, The Others Among Us, the 2006 miniseries by A.J. Lieberman and Al Barrio Nuevo. Being confused about what exactly the point of that story was is not surprising. It's not a very well-written story. It's an instance of editorial mandates and perhaps rogue creators trying to force the Martian Manhunter into a role that he doesn't fit in very well, making him somewhat an adversarial presence to Earthlings, certainly hostile toward them based on slights. And yes, the story does center around racism, specifically between the Green Martians and, as I mentioned, these sort of prehistoric white Martians that are still present in our time, who unfortunately survived via a construct called the Still Zone, which was Grant Morrison overtly trying to bring back the Phantom Zone or incorporate that concept into the Martian Manhunter mythos, where it had not been before. The original White Martians were created in 1969 by Denny O'Neil and Dick Dillon for a single story, that one story I referenced that basically got rid of the Martians by creating the Civil War. And because it was the White Martians, specifically Commander Blanks, that had caused the destruction of Martian civilization and rendered that planet uninhabitable, you would by default assume them to be evil, at least Commander Blanks Blanks was. But that aspect really wasn't played with again until around 1984, when Greg Potter and Gene Colan began a miniseries under the title Jim, Son of Mars, which picked up story threads from the Bronze Age Martian Manhunter stories, the few that existed, and most specifically the racial conflict introduced in that Justice League of America story from '69. And again, the story centered on the ongoing racial conflict between these two surviving groups of Martians on a hostile desert world. But because the Martian Manhunter was simultaneously being reintroduced into the Justice League of America with his own very Martian-centric story involving a Martian invasion of Earth, Jim, Son of Mars became Jim, Son of Saturn. And about 14 years later, that miniseries was incorporated back into the Martian Manhunter lore by John Ostrander, and it was revealed that the Saturnians were actually clone laborers created by earlier Martians. So once again, you've got this central theme of racism, which while it hadn't been addressed in Martian Manhunter stories for a great many years, via that one very important story that sent the Martian Manhunter into an interstellar diaspora for most of the Bronze Age, and this discarded Martian miniseries being reintegrated into his intended setting, coupled with the new White Martian invasion in 1996 under Morrison, those themes of race war, civil war, were reinforced as an important part of the Martian Manhunter's mythos. And in fact, there had been elements of that in place even prior to that, because in retrospect, it's hard not to look at the Silver Age Martian Manhunter stories and wonder why Detective John Jones had to be a white male, and who authorized Martian Manhunter to be the one guy who was sending back all these alien visitors who popped up on Earth to space, who made him the border guard, who deputized him. Specifically, he would often send off Martians. In at least one instance, he not only pegged a yellow-skinned Martian, the only instance of there being a yellow-skinned Martian in the main comics, as somebody who needed to go, but specifically as a criminal. And it's difficult not to read perhaps some racism there, because it seemed like John didn't have to look much further than his yellow skin to know that this guy was up to no good. The truth is, though, race in Martian Manhunter comics, specifically as it relates to John Jones, has never really been adequately addressed. Martians of other races are pretty much always depicted as invaders, hostile invaders going against the Earthlings, who are of course weaker, don't have all the superpowers that the Martians have, and aren't inclined to give up their Earth to these invaders. Also in the classic Martian Manhunter stories, pretty much all those visiting Martians that Manhunter had a problem with were engaged in criminal activities, whether he knew it at the time that he ran into them or not. So his responses to them could be vindicated. However, you have the complicating matter of Miss Martian, Megan Morse, who is one of those white Martians who was from a much earlier time than the time that the Manhunter grew up in, but who turned on her own people, who actually impersonated a green Martian despite being a white Martian by birth, and who became a heroine to the Earthlings in the identity of Miss Martian. In the comics, John Jones has never had a significant relationship with that character. In animation, John Jones acts as her uncle and cares for her and watches out for her despite her not truly being a relative of his and not even being of the same race as him, arguably not even of the same species. But that is a matter that is worth addressing, and most certainly I would like to see it addressed in a more thoughtful way than was handled in that fairly awful, bizarre, illogical 2006 miniseries, The Others Among Us.
I think Martian Manhunter is actually a mix of Superman and Batman. He has Superman's powers and the whole idea that he's an alien, but he has Batman's, not the same anger, but he has the same goals. He's witnessed genocide, and he's the last one, and Bruce is the last one of his family. He has Alfred, but he's still compelled to save his city, and I think that's what John wants to do with humanity, because there's so many genocides that we have committed on ourselves. Ethnic cleansings, what's going on in society now with terrorist groups, extremists. That's why I find him and his backstory just incredibly interesting, that he would still, after all these years of isolation, come back and decide to help. So I just find that completely admirable. That's why I love him as a character.
In the early days of DC pushing the notion of there being a trinity of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, who were like the guiding lights of the DC universe, despite having marginalized Wonder Woman for decades. I don't know if it was ever verbalized or if it was just something that I picked up on, but I got the sense of they're trying to position Wonder Woman as a middle point between the extremes of Batman and Superman. That Batman was severe, haunted, and that Superman was more of the gifted, good, compassionate, angelic one, and that Wonder Woman was supposed to fall somewhere in the middle where she was a fighter, but she also had incredible power, but not the degree that Superman had. I never cared for that because I think Wonder Woman is such a distinct character on her own, and I think that greatly minimizes her character. She deserves better than that, especially when you factor in how much the Superman character actually stole from Wonder Woman's characterization. A lot of the aspects that would fall into that spectrum were originated by Wonder Woman, so why would you compare her to this thief of her aspects of her persona? Similarly, I'm not a huge fan of the notion of trying to say that Manhunter is a combination of Superman and Batman, but at the same time, if I'm wanting to do an elevator pitch, if I'm wanting to explain how to write Martian Manhunter stories, and clearly based on most of the books available in trade that has Martian Manhunter's name on the spine, writers could benefit from this simplification. Yes, to a large degree, Manhunter is a combination of Superman and Batman, in the sense that the type of stories he involves himself in and his basic persona is closer to Batman's. He's a darker figure. He can deal in the shadier, more noir aspects of the superheroics there. But at the same time, he has extraordinary powers. He is an alien. There is a strong science fiction element to his stories by virtue of simply being about a Martian. In that respect, he's more like Superman. So ideally, you would find a way of combining those two aspects. Probably one of the best examples of that is the John Ostrander, Tom Mandrake series from 1998, because they did have the Manhunter fighting fantastic threats, but with a greater element of horror and fantasy than would be appropriate to Superman, and with the sort of moral ambiguities that are more common in Batman stories. Certainly, if you look at one of the main Martian Manhunter foils in recent decades, Malefic, created in that 98 run, he's essentially the Joker with Martian Manhunter's powers. Closer to the Heath Ledger Joker than, say, Cesar Romero, but you get the gist. Bette Noir is something of a temptress. She's this voluptuous, scantily clad psychic vampire, not unlike Poison Ivy, but she's also immaterial. She has psychic abilities, so she's just working on a broader level than someone like Catwoman. Ideally, writers would dig deeper than that, but at the same time, if you look at the recent 2012 Martian Manhunter so-called ongoing series, personally, I think 12 issues is a maxi series, especially when you end the series while the book is still selling relatively well, but that's a tirade for another time. That book so embraced science fantasy that they forgot to tell stories about the actual Martian Manhunter. They took Malefic and turned him into a red-skinned sorcerer where he had once been Martian Manhunter's evil twin brother. Basically, it had no regard for Martian Manhunter or any of his lore, and it told a 2000 AD story instead. I have major misgivings about the 1998 ongoing Martian Manhunter series, and I think that a book that runs for 38 issues and only ends because the sales aren't where they wanted to be counts as an ongoing series. But certainly they wrote stories for Martian Manhunter. Most of the stories generated in that series started from what kind of stories should be told with this type of character. And unfortunately, I don't think that very many creators since have come at it from that most basic level. Anytime you're writing a character, the first thing you want to do is figure out who the character is and what kind of stories have been told about the character and should be told about that character. So turning that character out, telling whatever story you want to tell, and then throwing a Martian Manhunter logo on the cover, that's not fair to me as a fan. It's not fair to the character. So yeah, if it takes just saying that he's Batman combined with Superman to make sure that doesn't happen again, fine, we'll go with that. Name me another character where that really works. How many other characters can you think of where you could say, oh, he's like a mix of Superman and Batman? That's kind of a unique thing. You don't say that green is derivative of yellow and blue. You get green by combining yellow and blue, but green is its own thing. It's neither one of those other two things. It's a whole new thing based on those two influences. So sure, Superman plus Batman equals Martian Manhunter. That's a good starting point. I can roll with that.
I feel like he's a little bit more of a combination of Superman and Aquaman. But if you take away Aquaman's sort of arrogance and Superman's like Boy Scout tendencies, definitely that last surviving son of Krypton kind of thing to him. But I think where we get that aspect of Superman, I think the whole idea of being the other comes from that Aquaman side of his character, where Aquaman is, no pun intended, but he's a fish out of water wherever he goes. He's on land, he has to be carried around to fly and get places. So you have like that bond between those two characters of like, yeah, we both don't really know what's going on with these people on Earth, on land.
I disagree somewhat with his observation observation, but not for the most obvious reasons. The first is that Martian Manhunter isn't a fish out of water. He's an immigrant from another culture who's adapted to our own. Occasionally, certainly in instances like that awful The Others Among Us miniseries, J'onn J'onzz is portrayed as somebody who doesn't fully understand Earth culture and is very aggressive, very hostile toward it. That representation of the character is an outlier. J'onn's a smart guy, and J'onn's been on Earth for a long time. He understands humanity. He understands where we come from. He understands what motivates us. He's bemused by us. He's frustrated by us, but he understands us, and he understands how to get by amongst us. Now, there are some stories from early in his career, like American Secrets and The New Frontier, where he's still figuring it out, where he is uncertain and questioning. But again, that's from early in his career. That's when he first got here. That's when he's learning the language and learning the culture. In a modern setting amongst contemporary heroes, that shouldn't be an issue. He may not always be happy with us or the choices we make, but he's forgiving of us and is typically bemused by our quirks and our limitations. He's not Data. He's not Worf. He's Spock mixed with McCoy because he doesn't speak in a manner that's overly formal. He uses conjunctions. He allows himself to become flustered and have headaches and grouse, but he is more powerful than us. He is more intelligent than us. He is much more worldly and otherworldly than us. And sometimes he's just going to cock an eyebrow and basically be like, really? So in that respect, he's the steady one. Earthlings are the fish out of water. J'onn can go in the water as a fish, or he can fly through the air as a bird. J'onn's cool. We're the ones who don't get it. We're the ones who screw up around J'onn. And I think that's very much key to understanding the character, because when you don't get that, you end up with some pretty awful stories. Most of the stories where J'onn can't understand humanity and where he has major culture clashes with them, where he's the one who's acting immature, don't reflect well on the character, aren't strong stories objectively, and I'd just as soon nip that mentality in the bud. The other area where I have dispute is in the representation of Aquaman in the same fashion. I'm grateful to Geoff Johns for turning away from that interpretation of the character. That notion got very popular around the time of JLA Year One because Mark Waid and Brian Augustine made a point of showing Aquaman's inability to adapt to surface life, his natural inclinations to speak softly because sound carries better in water than through air, his not understanding that you don't need a special wrench to put in a light bulb, and most especially his aggression, his anger. He would get very upset with his inability to adapt to surface life. And the reason why I have a problem with that is I don't like the notion of Aquaman being Atlantean, because Aquaman is already a character who is something of a ripoff of the original popular aquatic super being. Prince Namor was conceived by the union of a surface-dwelling father and an Atlantean mother. He was raised in Atlantis. He had powers that other Atlanteans did not have, and pink skin where most of the rest of his people had blue. And so he was always very angry. He was always very suspicious of the surface world. He was constantly trying to prove himself as an Atlantean to his fellows and contrasting himself to the surface world because that was not a world that was his own. He could exist in both worlds in a way that Atlanteans couldn't, but he was never one of us. He was always very arrogant. A lot of his stories are based around misunderstandings or assumptions made on his part. That's what drives the character, is his conflict with the surface world and his dual nature. To my mind, what most separates Aquaman from being Prince Namor the Submariner is that when he was originally conceived, he was a normal human who was given a formula by his father that allowed him to survive underwater and enhance his strength and speed and such. From his creation, what defined Aquaman from the Submariner was that he was a surface dweller. He has no issues with the surface world. He is an interloper in the aquatic world. And for most of his early adventures, that wasn't an issue because he didn't deal with a ton of fantasy elements. He tended to be a water-based hero who helped people in situations involving the water with his greater adaptability within that environment. Later on, decades later, in fact, he was connected to the Atlanteans, and it was decided that he was actually the lost king of Atlantis, and that he was the product of the union between a surface dweller and an Atlantean, exactly like Namor, unfortunately. But the core difference, again, was that he was raised by his father in a lighthouse. He was used to being on the water. His entire life was spent exploring the waters near the bay where his father worked, but he was still a surface dweller. The surface was still his natural environment. His loyalties were always to the surface first, even when he became king of Atlantis, which was a major problem because the Atlanteans knew it and they didn't appreciate it very much. But he was our representative in Atlantis, where Namor was always an Atlantean who comes into conflict with our world. In the post-Crisis era, Keith Giffen and later Peter David played up the fact that Aquaman was neither Atlantean nor a Surface Dweller, that he was basically Tarzan of the Porpoise. He was raised by dolphins, and so he didn't fit in either world. And so again, those misunderstandings, those gaps in education became defining aspects of the character, but I don't think they ever fit the character, and they made him too much like Namor. Aquaman, to my mind, should be happy and well-adjusted and always on our side. He's the guy that goes into the water to fight the bad stuff in the waters that threaten us. He's the surface's hero in the depths. And I think Jeff Johns has gone a long way toward reclaiming that aspect of the character.
I guess my biggest thing with the comparison to Batman is I just don't really see that personality in John Jones. If we're looking at the New 52 and we're looking at that breakdown of the 4 different aspects of his personality, I don't see that strong force of will that you get from Batman. The way that those personalities were broken down, or those traits were broken down, actually kind of made me think that Martian Manhunter was sort of a weak character and an immature character personality-wise.
We haven't touched on the fact that Martian Manhunter is an incredibly cerebral character. That for all of his strength and for all of the physically destructive capabilities that he could have, so much of what he does is built on his psychic powers, his abilities to read minds, his abilities to read people, his abilities to read situations, which is very similar to Bruce Wayne.
But he's also really uncomfortable often using those powers.
Which I think is probably the most interesting aspect of his character, to be honest.
I think that totally makes sense to his character, though.
I'm so glad you brought up the word naive, because that is the word I would have used to describe Martian Manhunter. And throughout the 3 main titles that we read, we saw a lot of naivete in Justice League of America Year 1 and a lot of paranoia also. And this was also a situation where his lack of willingness to use his powers actually ended up being extremely unhelpful, because if he had just used his powers to figure out who these people were and whether or not he could trust them, then he doesn't need to sneak around and make 12 different versions of himself to spy on everybody, have all these files that everybody can see that causes almost the near destruction of every superhero on Earth.
Well, the first problem here is that DC Comics has not published very many trade paperbacks with the name Martian Manhunter on the spine that collect good stories. They haven't produced very many good Martian Manhunter stories in the last 10 to 15 years, and now they put everything in trades, so that's a natural consequence. However, it's also your own fault for picking some of the worst of those options. You didn't bother to read any of the early stories, which are collected in Showcase Presents Martian Manhunter's Volume 1 and 2, which cover his entire 13-year early career. So you're not informed on who the character was at his original conception by his creators and the main people who defined the character for the Silver Age. Then you also skip the 2 volumes of Martian Manhunter by John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake, collecting the first year and a half of his solo ongoing series. You instead chose a terrible miniseries from 2006 that had no great bearing on the character and that was wiped away within a couple of years of its being pulled together, featuring a version of the character that doesn't appear in any comics anymore and only appeared in comics for a few years. So that's your own fault. You also picked up the New 52 version of the character, which is understandable. That's the most current version of the character. There was a brand new trade paperback that you could find at a Barnes & Noble. But as I've already made reference to, that wasn't a very good Martian Manhunter story. That was a sci-fi story that happened to involve some minor trappings of the Martian Manhunter, but had very little regard for them. Whatever my misgivings about the Ostrander Mandrake series, at least that was an ongoing book that was designed to be about John Jones, that has a pedigree, that has fans that are vocal on the internet. If you looked on the internet to see what books fans of the character recommended, I'm certain that those trades would have come up, and I'm fairly certain that the others among us would not have. The main book that I would want to put into somebody's hands to get them to know who the Martian Manhunter is via one of the best stories told with the character, unfortunately isn't available in print in the English language in the United States. It's a 3-issue miniseries, American Secrets. That one's excellent. That's a wonderful gateway to the character. DC The New Frontier is another excellent story that has a very strong portrayal of the Martian Manhunter that is wonderfully encompassing of a variety of shorter stories that were told about the character over the years. The book reflects his earliest stories. It reflects some really great stuff that was done by Steve Englehart in the 70s, a really swell Secret Origin story by Mark Verheiden in the 80s. It reflects the J.M. DeMatteis miniseries from 1988, which itself I don't think is the strongest material, and I think that in particular the art would be very off-putting, but was a major impact on the character and helped to shape the character as he's understood today and made him the much-loved character character that he is with modern audiences. And if you're going to grab a JLA book, I would recommend A Midsummer's Nightmare as well, which was the book that really made me a Martian Manhunter fan. And I think it also tells a great story where the character works within the context of the JLA, but also contrasts against the other members and shows that his being isn't entirely tied to the Justice League, that he has an existence beyond them, which is a notion that is very much challenged over the course of this podcast that I'm listening to, and is a problem for general audiences, it seems, since so many people don't view Martian Manhunter as a character that can stand on his own. JLA Year One is a very fun story. I enjoyed it. If somebody were looking for a JLA story, I'd recommend it. And with a better selection of Martian Manhunter related books, I would also recommend that to somebody who is new to the character. But it's unfortunate that the portrayal of the character in that book reinforces the very negative interpretations of the character in the other two books that you folks read. I enjoyed most of the writer's takes on the earliest green neophyte versions of the Silver Age DC heroes. I enjoyed how they related to one another for the most part. I liked how awkward Manhunter was in trying to relate to other metahumans, which is not something he would have been used to before being in the Justice League. That does reflect, to some degree, his character in classic stories and more so in a modern context, but it's still true to the character. But the conceit of him taking on a variety of identities to spy on his other heroes was somewhat problematic for me as I was reading it. And then the fact that he would keep all of that very delicate information in a file cabinet somewhere, that makes no sense. It doesn't think through the character. It neglects one of his powers, Total Recall, where he essentially has a photographic memory and the ability to recall anything he's experienced throughout his life. Plus, he can, through telepathy, access memories of his ancestors as revealed in the Ostrander Manhunter series. So writing down information on paper that could be retrieved by other aliens, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. That's just a problem with the writing. That's a big plot hole. They could have papered that over very easily by just having one of the alien invaders from that series have telepathic powers or be able to access Manhunter's telepathic powers and draw that out of his mind. As much as I like the Manhunter's power of telepathy, I do think that it's been overemphasized over the years. Specifically, telepathy was not a power that Manhunter used very often in the Silver Age. It was present in his very first origin story. It's how he learned the English language and learned some of the basics of Earth so that he could communicate with Dr. Erdell before he passed away. But very shortly into his solo run, that power was dropped because it's very problematic. It's such an incredible shortcut in storytelling, especially in mystery stories, that it just made him too powerful and was too difficult to write around. That power was brought back when the character returned to mainstream comics in 1984, and it did separate him from a lot of other heroes in the DC universe. Telepathy is not a very common power at DC the way that it is at Marvel, specifically among their mutant characters. So that gives him a distinction. But as you noted, it's also an issue that you have to write around, because if you have telepathy, it makes it very difficult to explain why characters have to go through various steps and go through their paces in order to resolve an adventure. One way in which that was approached was that going into somebody's mind without their consent is a violation of their being. In the Silver Age stories, Mars didn't have telepathic Martians, so that wasn't an issue. In the more modern age stories, Ostrander pointed out that Martians did not violate one another's privacy, that they could communicate through their minds, but a deeper probe into their psyches was prohibited by Martian law, because again, it is a violation. It was referred to in that series as a rape even. I do think that somebody probing your innermost being without your consent would qualify for a term that extreme. So when you advocate that the Manhunter just run around and invade everybody's mind, you're essentially saying, why doesn't he become a serial rapist? He's a superhero, that's why not. Also, when you're going into somebody else's mind, that imperils your own psyche, because you're exposing yourself to their neuroses, you're exposing yourself to telepathic assault, you're exposing yourself to the mental detritus of people. It would be maddening. In some stories, Manhunter has been driven mad and been broken psychically by allowing too much of his self to be exposed via telepathy. For all people in all walks of life, restraint is important. Just because you have the capacity to do something doesn't mean you should or would, especially something as sensitive as telepathy. So I don't see that it's terribly naive or a weakness in Manhunter's character that he doesn't waterboard telepathically people that he's going up against, or especially his own associates. But speaking specifically to the New 52 Martian Manhunter series, I have to agree that the depictions of these aspects of the Manhunter's character were weak. The character as a whole and his purpose within that story treated him as a villain, certainly as spineless and short-sighted. As a Martian Manhunter fan, I frankly have been unable to read the second half of the run so far because the interpretation of the character character was so poor and so aggravating to me that it makes me angry. Because I do a podcast where I have to talk about those issues after I've read them, I haven't been able to bring myself to read and discuss those issues in full without drowning my microphone in spittle from how frustrated I am and how upset I am with that misinterpretation of the character. So yeah, I have to agree. That character in that story is very weak. I think that character has been much better employed in other areas of the New 52, and there aren't any great New 52 Martian Manhunter stories either. It's just that at least he's been better than this book.
If we're worried about doing everything right, then what about in Brave New World, where he completely, using, again, his naivete, overlooks every procedure and every character's advice about what he should be doing and how he's going about things the wrong way, because all that he wants to think and do and see is that he's got more Martians other than him.
In the context of the Others Among Us miniseries, your read is absolutely correct. It's a bad book, and it's a character assassination of John Jones, so I can't defend that. Personally, I like to think that John Jones was suffering from temporary brain trauma inflicted by Black Adam in the World War III event miniseries, and he just wasn't thinking right. That's why he had the big dumb asparagus head and a costume that made him look like the equivalent of a Martian My Chemical Romance fan. Then he died and got better.
I still feel like we're ending with a character who follows his heart and emotions more than his head, which I think still comes back to my feelings that this is a character who is a little bit more immature than the Superman and the Batman of the Justice League. I feel like John Jones, and a lot of it comes from being an off-worlder. He doesn't know how things are. He's learning about how Earth works, but he's also like a warrior. And so a lot of the stuff about like working with a team is like the kind of thing that you don't need to be from Earth to know. We're just saying that, you know, he does come from a warrior class of people. He was designed to be the ultimate weapon, so he's definitely coming from a warrior class of people.
Yes, he definitely comes from a warrior class of people in a book published in the last year that ignored the other 59 years of the character's history. John Jones has been shown to be a warrior on very few occasions. When his entire Silver Age history was cast in a new light by one Justice League of America comic in 1969, he went from being a scientist stranded on Earth to a military science leader engaged in a racially based civil war on his planet, who'd been exiled from that world for 13 years after being tried and sentenced by a kangaroo court. So in that one comic, yeah, he was a warrior. That aspect of the character also comes up in a 1977 story arc where he becomes embroiled in a conspiracy by a rogue Martian military leader to invade a peaceful alien city-state. It came up again in 1984 when a rogue Martian military leader conspired to invade the planet Earth, and John Jones had to try to stop him. However, all of those stories were retconned out of existence by the 1988 Martian Manhunter miniseries, which revealed that all memories of John being part of some sort of warrior society were implanted in his mind by Saul Ordell to help him deal with the real trauma of having lost his entire race to a plague. So you have to take the Etch-a-Sketch and shake it because all that stuff went away. In the 1998 ongoing series, John Jones was described as a manhunter, which was essentially like the police officers of his world. So in that respect, you could say that he was part of a warrior class, if you want to consider actual police officers in that same manner. I'm not sure if I do. I think that's a fairly liberal interpretation of that term. And then the whole warrior class thing has kind of been brought up in the New 52. But those are pretty spotty examples, mostly a drawing from one series from within the last year. I don't think that that's a valid interpretation of the entire history of a character that's been around for 6 decades. As far as maturity goes, most comic book fans with a basic knowledge of DC series would qualify the Martian Manhunter as among the most mature superheroes of all. He is a father figure, a mentor to other heroes, including Superman. That's translated into other media. He was a mentor to Superman in Smallville. He's a mentor to Supergirl on her television show. In the Justice League cartoon, he was like the grandpappy of the League, and eventually he was the guy who just stayed on the Watchtower and told everybody else where they needed to go. So it's a very narrow interpretation of the character based really on a couple of miniseries that you just read. It makes me wonder how much knowledge you have of the character in general to come to such a uncommon conclusion. And especially when you want to compare his maturity level to Batman, a guy who hangs out in his basement He-Man woman haters club with more young boys than Michael Jackson, whose entire life has been defined by childhood trauma, who does not work and play well with others. He's a bully. He's an egotist. His superpower is that he's rich enough to buy a lot of toys, and then he proceeds to name all those toys toys after himself. Batmobile, bat plane, slides down a bat pole. Seriously? This is your icon of maturity? I'll give you more of a pass on Superman. But again, as I mentioned, he had a maturity that he lost in the post-crisis interpretation of the character, because as another podcaster, Michael Bay, likes to point out, whenever Superman has a problem, he just flies to Kansas and consults his mom while eating her apple pie. That doesn't quite portray him as a grown-ass man. But then he did marry his longtime partner, Lois Lane. They were married for a good number of years. In some continuities, they had children. I would agree that Superman is a much more mature character than Batman. But at the same time, one of my favorite Superman stories takes place in the early 80s, where the villain Mongol, in his first appearance, kidnaps pretty much the entire Superman supporting cast of the time, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Steve Lombard, and threatens to kill them if Superman doesn't steal a Death Star for him. As it happens, the Martian Manhunter is the keeper of the keys to the Death Star and explains to Superman that the threat that the Death Star poses to all of existence clearly eclipses the threat of Mongol to his three little buddies. Instead of the two heroes trying to work something else out, Superman just decides to have a punch out with the Manhunter, beats him up, steals his car keys, and then hands them off to Mongol. So let's just say that Martian Manhunter hasn't cornered the market on emotion-based, perilous thinking that comes off as slightly less than heroic in hindsight.
Because the character becomes so malleable, he doesn't have one set known identity. Because there are stories where he's written where he's similar to Aquaman. There are stories where he's written where he's similar to Batman. There are stories that are written where he's similar to Superman. But what it all comes down to is kind of like everything we've said, and I'm not necessarily knocking the character, I don't hate the character or anything, but so much of our conversation has revolved around what characters is he similar to, that I think it goes to show that there's really not an established archetypical Martian Manhunter identity. He kind of becomes malleable, which is I think why he ends up working so well in teams, and why so many people have put him in the Justice League, because depending how you write the Justice League, you can write him as the heart and soul character, you can write him as the outsider character, the paranoid outsider character, you can write him as the alien among humans, you can write him as the most human among the humans, even though he's an alien. And I think that, like I said, I think that can be a good thing, but to try and get like a full picture of the Martian Manhunter, it becomes really tricky.
And you know what makes it really tricky? When instead of looking at the character's interpretation across multiple media, like the Justice League cartoon, the Smallville TV show, the Supergirl TV show, or his long-standing appearances with reliable creative teams, such as the 12 plus years that Jack Miller invested in the character in the Silver Age, the 5 years Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis wrote the character, his 2 years under Christopher Priest, 3 years under Grant Morrison, 3 years under John Ostrander, his fairly consistent interpretation for much of his time in the Justice League over the span of multiple decades. It's very tricky if instead of basing your take on the character on those more reliable sources, you try to pin an interpretation of the character on an outlier miniseries that was pretty much disregarded as soon as it came out, on a new series that at the time you're recording the podcast was not even halfway through its story, in a continuity that's to some degree is already being shifted out by the DC Rebirth, or if you don't try to judge the character based on his earliest interpretations as reflected by JLA Year One, disregarding the fact that the character progressed and matured from that point. I can see how it'd be tricky that you can't quite get a grasp of the character. Alternately, what tends to happen is if you have a character you're not familiar with, you're much more likely to try to look at characters you are familiar with and then compare them. So it's not really funny that you keep comparing the Martian Manhunter to other characters. It's sad that you assume that you have a working knowledge of that character based on very limited resources, and that you don't understand basic human nature of trying to take something that's unfamiliar and connect it to something familiar. You know, when Star Wars first came out, you might explain it to your grandpa as it was kind of like Flash Gordon, or when Indiana Jones came out, he was kind of like Alan Quatermain. But you probably wouldn't make those comparisons today because they're more than that. It just gives you an opportunity to get a sense of the character when you're not terribly familiar with it.
He seems to be so like match for match with Superman in ability. Like, okay, laser eyes, super strength, ability to fly, and let's take it a step further, can phase in and out of objects, can read people's minds, can sort of do like a little bit of a hypnosis mind control thing at times when he wants to, can change size, shape, become literally anything, and a lot of things that I've never heard of, seen, or imagined because they're ancient Martian beasts that he knows about. He very much is a character whose presence almost makes Superman kind of unnecessary on the team. Like, they made such a big deal in Justice League Year 1, like, oh my god, we're going to ask Superman, is Superman going to join the team? Like, oh my god, Superman. And I'm like, you guys have somebody who can do everything Superman does and then some, so like, why does it make a difference?
Well, a major point of the story that's come up a number of times in your podcast is that the Justice League didn't know what all of Martian Manhunter's powers were, and the more powers they find out about, the more terrified they become of him, because he's not Superman, because he's not immediately beloved and trusted the way Superman is, because he's this mysterious green shape-shifting being. But with regards to the Justice League, I agree with you. I don't see the need for the Martian Manhunter to be in a Justice League that already has Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman. Martian Manhunter has spent so much time as a member of the Justice League, and specifically he spent too much time as a member alongside these other powerhouse characters. It tends to make him into a jobber. Because he's so powerful, he's also often the first one to fall in a story involving those characters. Because he's the least popular, he's the one you can throw under the bus, and you're not going to show off those powers as much as you could because you're too busy showing off the big guns, the guys who sell books for you. John Jones isn't needed in the Justice League now and hasn't been for some time, so he needs to either be developed as a solo character or he should be in another team so he can demonstrate his powers there. I really like the idea of him being a member of Stormwatch entering the New 52. I thought that he would be more valuable in that role and have an opportunity to show off more of his unique character and powers in that different context. And I also love the idea of him being an emissary to the Wildstorm characters entering the DC universe, the way that he was receptive to the Charlton characters who joined the Justice League International and the DC universe at the same time under his stewardship. The problem with Stormwatch, besides the fact that it was rudderless and DC seemed to have driven off their key writer on that book after the first story arc, was that despite the name Stormwatch, the team was actually made up of the former members of the Authority, including the Batman analog Midnighter and the Superman analog Apollo, who of course are going to be more popular to Wildstorm fans. And so you would tend to negate the impact of the Martian Manhunter under those circumstances. And if you look at those books, they also emphasized his less Superman-like powers, his telepathy, his intangibility, his shape-shifting. Not that there's anything wrong with that, not that that couldn't have worked. And in fact, I would say that in the issues of Stormwatch that featured the Manhunter, that character was more impressive and more important to the team than their world's finest analogs. But he wasn't on that team for very long. And then he moved over to the Justice League of America, where again, he could have been a pretty valuable member. He was intentionally brought into that team to counter Superman in the event that the American Justice League had to fight the more classical Justice League. And they were actually building up to that sort of a confrontation ahead of the Trinity War, and then decided that Trinity War was going to be an entirely different thing than that. And if there's ever a point in which Martian Manhunter rejoins the main Justice League, he'll get to bring on the legacy of having been a member of the Justice League of America in the New 52 and the Justice League United group. So once again, he has ties to the Justice League that few, if any, other characters could possibly have, and certainly not the sheer number of different Justice Leagues. But I've always felt that DC should have another major hero team besides the Justice League for the adults and the Titans for the younger generation. Unfortunately, sales and editorial indicate otherwise.
Okay, so Vision's Superman, but he's really, really depressed about losing everybody he knows.
Except, of course, the Vision was introduced about 5 years into the run of Avengers, who were themselves inspired by the Justice League that was formed by the Martian Manhunter, who debuted also coincidentally before the Hulk, in case you want to do a green guy comparison as well. And he has the psychic powers that Professor Xavier would have years down the line. If you want to minimize the character, you should probably go ahead and broaden your scope. But here's another thing. I liked the Vision when I read him in Avengers comics, but I was never a huge Avengers fan, so I didn't read a ton of those appearances. So when I saw that the Vision was going to be in Avengers Age of Ultron, I felt like, well, this is probably the closest I'm ever going to get to Martian Manhunter in a big screen movie, so I'm going to look forward to that, and I do like the Vision. So I watched that movie, and I watched Captain America Civil War, and you see that the Vision is a very rigid character. He's a very towing the party line sort of fellow. He's guided heavily by logic. He is a robot automaton. And of course, another defining characteristic is that he's in love with a Scarlet Witch. And as I watched those two movies, I started to realize, I really don't like the Vision that much. And it reminded me that he was like that in the comics too. He just happened to be in comics where those elements that I didn't like about him weren't as emphasized. But one of the first Vision appearances I ever read, he's compromised by being connected to an alien computer, and it causes him to go all Skynet and basically try to take over the world for the betterment of humanity. From his very introduction, the Vision was a creation of one of the Avengers' greatest enemies, Ultron, and intended to infiltrate and destroy the team. So in many ways, the Vision is actually a polar opposite of the Martian Manhunter because he's a character that the Avengers trust, even though they shouldn't, even though he has turned on them repeatedly, been turned against them through outside forces, someone who's ruled by intellect and computer logic instead of emotion. And then you have J'onn J'onzz, who is too often suspected and maligned and alienated, even though he's more human than human. He's more trustworthy than humans. He's always been there for the Justice League and always defended them in their worst times. He's loving and guided by his empathy and his emotion while also being mature enough to make good decisions. And he's somebody who tries his best to not interfere with the natural course of things. He's never going to try to take over the world. He tries to fight other Martians and keep them from doing that. So in fact, aside from the ability to turn intangible and some superficial costume elements, you couldn't be more wrong.
The concept of J'onn J'onzz being the last Martian wasn't introduced until like 20 years or so after the character was introduced.
And that was retconned too.
Exactly. Like at one point, his parents were alive and like he went back to Mars and would communicate with people on Mars and stuff. It's like they purposely chose to make him more Superman-like.
So one of the Martian Manhunter's defenders has clearly cracked open the Showcase Presents volumes, and while I wouldn't recommend anybody not connected to the character in a professional capacity read those, unless they're fans of that material, I respect the knowledge base, and it's no wonder this is one of the defenders of the character. I would like to know the general ages of the people involved in this podcast, though, because they have a very nebulous command of what happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Makes me feel even older than I usually do.
One thing that bothered me when I was reading through the Martian Manhunter solo titles, though, was that does he have enemies that aren't white Martians?
Justice League villains, I guess.
Antares, Bet Noir, Darkseid, the Demon Etrigan, Despero, the Devilman of Pluto, the Wizard Diabolu and his Idlehead, Dr. Trap, Lynn Gameron, Gorilla Grodd, the Headmaster, Human Falcon, the Human Squirrel, Korg, the Last Angry God, Kanto, the Lizard Men, the Mercurian, Mr. Moth, Mr. V, Mongol, Professor Arnold Hugo, the Prophet, Savor, Scorch, the Swarm, Thantos, the 3-in-1 Man, Tybalt Baxar, Vandal Savage, the entire Vulture criminal organization, and that's excluding anything Martian. Any color of Martian, any creature from Mars, the Saturnians, even Tor, the robot criminal of Mars.
And I know that Martian Manhunter hasn't been like a super popular character, so he doesn't have like a huge amount of solo titles out there.
There's about 40 books total.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot. And to have only that many books and try to really have a whole lot of depth and, you know, to not only the character, but also to that character's rogues gallery, to having any kind of like, you know, like how Batman's got his Bat family and now Spider-Man has Spider-Gwen and Spider-Woman and Miles Morales. There's like a team going on there.
Except there's actually 68 different comic books with Martian Manhunter's name on the cover, about 100 issues of Detective Comics where he's a backup strip, about another 24 issues of House of Mystery, 3 issues of Venture Comics where he was a backup, dozens of guest appearances where he alone was appearing, not as a member of a team, and unsurprisingly, he built up a supporting cast over those years. When he was Detective J'onn J'onzz, he reported to Captain Harding, and he was often partnered with Patrolwoman Diane Mead, as well as other members of the Middletown Police Department. When he was off pursuing the Idlehead of Diabolu, he had his other dimensional sidekick Zook. When he was pursuing V under the guise of Marco Xavier, he worked for Mr. Steel and had a number of compatriots in that crusade. He was betrayed by his friends Bel Juz, Norcott, and Ray Zeta during his time on Mars 2. When he ran the Just League Task Force, he reported to Hannibal Martin. During his solo series, he often butted heads with the Department of Extra-Normal Operations, and specifically had a relationship with the agent Cameron Chase. He befriended Prince Jim of Saturn. The Martian deity Ronmir often manifests to aid him. While he's friendly with a lot of Justice League members, he basically adopted Gypsy as a surrogate daughter. And among his lovers and partners in adventures include Princess Carissa of Saturn, Hunter Commander Jin, Green Martian, and Kishana Lewis, plus Miss Martian is loosely affiliated with him in the comics, much closer in animation. Again, it's difficult to criticize a character that you've only read a few recent stories about and know mostly from team books. Although, honestly, some of that I'm hearing here, I'm not even sure I'm familiar with the team books a lot of these folks are.
Can we talk about the fact that fire is his weakness for a second?
Absolutely.
Like that is one of those great, classic, crazy, like comic book weaknesses, you know, a la Green Lantern and wood.
I think that's actually, of all the superhero weaknesses, I think this is the one that plays off the best because it's an actual threat.
Given how petulant and sarcastic and pedantic and dismissive I've been in addressing this podcast. I do have to congratulate the entire group on this subject because for years I've had to defend the fire weakness or argue against it. And especially amongst fanboys, there's always that tendency to go, oh, I just have to light a match and he goes down, oh, he sucks, blah. I really enjoyed that these folks took the time to think through the fire weakness. They were all on board with it. They gave a variety of good reasons for it to exist, including subtextual ones. One in particular that I hadn't really thought about was that the beginning of civilization was man's discovery of fire. And of course, it's very relevant to myth, like Prometheus bringing fire down from the gods to man. So in much the same way that I like Gorilla Grodd as a representation of an earlier state of evolution in man, who nonetheless feels superior to and disdainful of Homo sapiens, and whose bigotry against humankind satirizes humanity's own racism and constructed hierarchies, and contrasting that base mentality against the Martian Manhunter, a being who, despite being an alien, is often more human than human, more empathetic, more understanding, more evolved, having as his greatest vulnerability the most essential building block of human civilization, works magnificently. And as they discuss in the podcast, having somebody as extraordinarily powerful as Martian Manhunter confronted with such a common everyday vulnerability automatically makes the stakes in his stories higher. His vulnerability heightens his heroism, and things can turn on J'onn J'onzz on a dime based on the flick of a bic. Essentially, any adversary at any power level can exploit that, but at the same time, you have the flexibility to use that weakness to the degree that you're inclined to, because there are so many explanations for why it exists, whether it was a necessary impurity implanted into the ancient Martians by the Guardians of the Universe because they had previously been fiery, malevolent beings that were destructive forces and had to be reined in, and so the Martian aversion of fire is actually a failsafe to keep them from reverting back to those beings, or if it's a psychosomatic concern of just J'onn J'onzz because it triggers traumatic memories of the deaths of his family and people, but doesn't actually have a physical component, or if you look at it the way it was done in the 1998 series, where it's actually a telepathically communicated virus that causes the Martians to shapeshift into flame and then disappear, all of which are springboards for interesting stories, all of which allow you to choose your setting of sensitivity. If you want him to fight mano a mano some fiery being and he has to just overcome it, he can in your story, but if you need him to get knocked out by a campfire, that's an option to you as well. It's just another component of J'onn J'onz's flexibility to allow for the greatest variety of stories. Also, Hal Jordan's weakness to yellow comes up, and considering how in-depth they went with the Manhunter's weakness, I'm surprised that nobody mentioned that yellow is synonymous with fear, and fear is the one thing that can compromise will and prevent you from doing what you set out to accomplish. It even works in the case of Sinestro because he's so afraid of other beings exploring their willpower and turning against his will that he succumbs to and becomes a manufacturer of fear energy throughout the universe. Oh, while I'm thinking about it, Ronmir made his primary appearance in the 1988 Martian Manhunter miniseries. Ronmir is the Martian god of fire and death, but also of creativity and life. And Ronmir is the being that brought the truth of the plague deaths of Mars to J'onn J'onzz, who erased the illusion planted in his mind by Saul Ardell of the more fanciful Mars of the Silver Age. And since one of the podcasters often brought up creativity and volatility associated with fire, that's very much canonical in Martian Manhunter stories.
Do you feel like Martian Manhunter is an effective solo character? And why is he what we would consider to be an underrated character?
August 7th, 2016 will mark the 20th anniversary of my being a true fan of Martian Manhunter. I'd had tangential relationships with this character for much of my life, but it was specifically the comic Justice League of Midsummer's Nightmare #2, which I know I bought the day that it came out, because at that point in time I was working at a comic shop, so I'd have unpacked the new comics that day and taken the ones that I wanted home with me that night. Within a couple of years of getting that comic, I also got on the internet and began actively exploring the character of Martian Manhunter. Having been turned into a fan, I wanted to know more about the character beyond just his appearances in Justice League, using internet resources, picking up back issues involving his solo appearances, guest appearances. I started putting the information that I learned on the internet via message boards and then a web page. From 2007 through 2014, I ran a blog that had daily updates discussing just the Martian Manhunter, his supporting cast, his villains, his stories. Literally, I don't think that anybody in human history has ever devoted as much of their time and mental energy to this one character than myself. So obviously, I feel that the character has the potential to be a standout as a soloist. I believe he's underrated in large part because of his connection to the Justice League, because he's so closely associated with that team and has been pretty much since its inception, that to the majority of comics readers, he doesn't have an identity outside of that team. Further, he wasn't a terribly popular character in the 50s and 60s. He was always a second stringer at best. His longevity can be largely chalked up to being a backup in a Batman comic. He managed 4 years in House of Mystery, but he wasn't the lead feature for very long. He had to share space with Robbie Reed, Dial H for Hero, and his longest-lived solo title was only 3 years, and it was critically well-received, but not a major commercial success. I don't think that very many Martian Manhunter solo stories are that strong compared to the potential of the character and compared to the needs of the marketplace to support this character on his own. I do think, as much as I appreciate the aesthetic value of his Silver Age costume, that running around in red straps with blue boxer shorts and cavalier boots and a cape probably, certainly, definitely limited his commercial appeal, especially throughout the oh-so-serious Bronze and Modern Ages. I think today it probably has a bit more of a retro charm, and I think the audience is now older and sophisticated enough to be able to appreciate him on those terms. But I also think that the move toward more science fiction-y spacesuits has helped to make it easier to translate him to other media and to appeal to a broader audience. And I think actually outside media representation has been one of the best indications of the strength of the character. I think that J'onn J'onzz was one of the most interesting characters on the Smallville show, and he was very well received on that show. Look no further than all the YouTube fan videos put together featuring Phil Morris's interpretation of the character as sort of an intergalactic Shaft. A take on the character that's actually closer to Martian Manhunter frenemy Glenn Gameron than the actual character is still valid and just darn cool. But especially the Supergirl TV series, Hank Henshaw / J'onn J'onzz has definitely been a highlight of that show. In terms of special effects, I think he's one of the coolest looking creations, CGI-wise, that the show's had. And he's in competition with the White Martian they produced besides, who also looked fantastic. David Harewood has been playing a father figure on that show, a very stabilizing element, while also bringing great drama through J'onn J'onzz's backstory, his conflicted role on Earth, working within an organization that would be hostile to his very being, trying to act as a mentor to Supergirl and her sister Alex Danvers, while also trying to protect them. The dichotomy of wanting them to be heroes and also wanting them to be safe. It's also very cool that J'onn J'onzz in live action is usually portrayed by actors of African descent. As much as DC's tried to push Cyborg as their minority hero within the Justice League, Cyborg's media penetration is fractional compared to Martian Manhunter's, specifically in live action. It's narrowed down to one tiny cameo in a poorly regarded blockbuster from earlier this year. Even outside of live action and animation, the character is typically voiced by African-American actors. And he's unquestionably a powerhouse, and so many concepts related to Martian Manhunter are figured in race and in segregation and in alienation, that not only is he an extraordinarily powerful representation of people of African descent, but also he works as an avatar for anybody who's othered. His shapeshifting can represent transgendered peoples. He can literally be any race, but ultimately he tends to choose to be a green-skinned Martian because that's who he truly is. He can be anything, but he wants to be who he is. He has a strong core identity. No matter what face he's wearing, underneath that shape is still the soul of J'onn J'onzz. But that malleability allows him to appear in virtually any type of story so long as the core of the character remains true. If it were me writing the stories, I would try to approach Manhunter as a cross between the Grant Morrison Animal Man series and Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. Martian Manhunter is a character that has been relevant to a variety of Earth times from the 1950s to the present, and he's a character who has spanned worlds. So his stories can be horrific. His stories can be fantastic. His stories can involve science fiction. His stories can be overwhelmingly humorous. Very few heroes are that versatile. And I think that you would want to play to that versatility by having completely different stories from arc to arc, completely different settings, lots of interaction with the greater DC universe to show what an important character he is outside of the Justice League within this continuity, and giving him an opportunity to flex a variety of muscles. I wouldn't even have consistent artists. I would be changing out the artists on a regular basis. And between his mental powers and his shape-shifting. Essentially, he should be a character for whom there are no roles aside from maintaining his core self, maintaining his heroism. But really, you should be able to go nuts with a Martian Manhunter story from issue to issue, from arc to arc. While at the same time, also, for God's sake, creators should be reading Martian Manhunter stories. You should draw from his lore. That lore does exist. When I listen to these podcasters who have no idea about so much of the history of the Manhunter, and much of it is available within 2 inexpensive black and white volumes reprinting the first 13 years of his appearances. I also think there's a lot of lore in the Bronze Age, but given that he was out of comics for about 16 years and made about 16 appearances over the course of those years, they're not that hard to collect. And there's some really juicy, meaty material there to play with. So bring in his continuity, bring in his villains that are specific to his character. Don't feel the need to create everything from whole cloth the way that John Ostrander did on his series. Or also an issue with that series is he liked to borrow heavily from other people's books, from Chase and from the Jack Kirby Fourth World. So he showed reverence for those continuities and he introduced his own characters, but virtually no mind was paid to anything that any other creators had done previously, specifically on the Martian Manhunter character. There's a lot of inspiration there. Trying to figure out how to tell a human squirrel tale in a modern context should be enough to inspire some pretty fun stories and remind you to keep a sense of humor, while at the same time when you explore the themes of racial violence and the terror of shape-shifting aliens, you can create something more along the lines of what Ridley Scott might dream up, or H.R. Geiger. The sky is really the limit with the character. You just have to apply the imagination and be willing to take that ride with him. So he's absolutely an underutilized character. He's absolutely a character with enormous solo potential, and I think he desperately needs to be outside of a team at this point in time to remind people of that potential so that he's not just a utility player on a super team. I also have to point out that I do think that some of the podcasters on this show took a devil's advocate position, and I do believe in the adversarial process, bringing out the best in the conflicting views. At times on this podcast, I probably came off pretty nasty, but I try to embrace that same philosophy. Let's dig in and really get to the core of this character and clash with our views. I have to say that a group of podcasters spending over an hour talking about a character that's dear to my heart and of great interest to me is valuable to me. I greatly appreciate it. I'm glad that it was out there. I wouldn't have spent pretty much my entire day going through this podcast minute by minute and responding to the most important aspects of it for my perspective. So I just want to thank ComicsVerse for going through the effort of making this happen, and to apologize if I hurt any feelings over the course of this. It really wasn't personal. It was just an opportunity to talk about stuff that I had always meant to talk about on this podcast and to use your own analysis as a springboard. Again, I hope that everybody who listened to this podcast listened to theirs first. If you go to my blog, you'll find the information you need to get there, or you can just listen to these guys right here.
So again, we want to remind you to check out ComicsVerse across all the different social medias: Facebook, Google, Tumblr, Twitter, YouTube. Listen to the podcast. If you've listened to it on SoundCloud, go listen to it again on iTunes, maybe a third time on Spreaker.
And if you do listen to it on iTunes, rate and review, please.
Yes, please do. Leave comments. Let us know what we're doing good. Let us know what we're doing bad. Argue with us. Tell us we're wrong. We're going to tell you that you're wrong.
What we're doing well.
Yeah, what we're doing well. We want to hear it all, so make sure that you leave us some feedback, and we will definitely respond. We've got people monitoring that stuff around the clock. But as always, this is ComicsVerse.
Your ego betrays you. Will you not listen to reason? This won't end well for you.
This was already a long episode, so I'll make this quick. The Maniacs from Mars across the robot brain of social media. The First Bat, Alan Middleton, Ange, Between the Pages, Cash Flag, Charming Kitties, Chris Sheehan, Clay Reddick, Coffee and Comics Blog, Comic Reflections, Darren and Ruth Sutherland, DCU Movie Page, Dr. G Nerdologist, Ed Moore and Ed Moore Jr., Inigo Montoya, Firestorm Fan, FKA Jason, Hicks, It's Plastic Man, Jeffrey Brown, Joseph Crawford, Carl Disley, Keith G. Baker, Cord Industries, Luke Sturgold, Martin Gray, Michael Wagner, Odell Abner Dracula, Oscar Blue Devil, Panel by Panel, Page by Page, Richard Field, Richard Ketterjohn, Ryan C. at Trash Film Guru, Scott Bachman, The Silver and Gold Podcast, Siskoid, Son of Cthulhu, Senate Alias Scarecrow, Trekker Talk Podcast, Waiting for Doom Podcast, and the Warlord Worlds Podcast. Podcast listeners should feel free to leave a comment on one of our blogs, either the Umbrella Rolled Spine Podcasts or the specific Idlehead of Diabolu blog. Both are available quite easily through Google searches. You can also shoot me a tweet at Commander Blanks. That's BLANX. Thank you for listening.